Alright, in this lesson we're going to be talking about the Eastern Front and just all the things that happened there. Well, not all the things. The main focus here is to talk about how it starts, especially with the battle called the Battle of Tannenburg. But I also am going to explain a little bit more of just how there's some differences between the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Mostly up to this point we've been talking more about what's going on the Western Front because that is where where World War I starts. So, in looking at this, it says that the Eastern Front was much larger and much more fluid. If you don't... I hope you get the idea of what I mean by saying larger. It covers a lot more area. Unlike the Western Front, you don't have the ocean on one side and the Alps mountains on the other side as just these hard points of you're not going to get around those. Eastern Europe, no, yes, there's some. It's got things like the Carpathian Mountains. We'll be talking about the Pripyat marshes today, a bit, some marshlands, but overall you just have this massive amount of area that is essentially all operational for World War I between the Russian, Austrian, and German armies. Now, if you're looking at that second point there where it talks about even bringing in Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, yes, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire do join in later on, and they become part of the Eastern Front. And it is just Russia over there, which kind of shows how Russia, as much as we've talked about them, and we'll talk a little bit more about them being a bit more on the backward side of things leading into World War I. Holy cow, do they have a ton of men to throw into it, and they're able to hold their own against all of those countries at once. And there's a lot of the speculation about, if they just would have done a couple things differently, maybe they would have been able to crush all four of them, the Ottomans, the Bulgarians, the Austrians, and the Germans all at the same time. Highly doubt that would have happened if Germany had their entire army over there and wasn't dealing with the Western Front. But it is up for speculation, I guess you could say. Now, what we need to talk about at this point is just... In previous videos, I've talked about how amazing the German and French armies are, and the British army to an extent. The British, with a small army, had the most experienced troops in the world. They were top-notch troops. The German and French armies are viewed as the best armies in the world, the most well-trained, the most well-organized, the most well-planned out, and just efficient. Just these amazing armies for the time period. The Austrian army, yeah, they're playing catch-up. The Russian army, definitely playing catch-up. Do they have basically soldiers that are on par, I guess you could say, with those of the Germans or the French? Well, yes. Do they have the efficiency, the organization, and most importantly, the industrialization to back that army up? No, not on the scale that, say, Germany or France does, or the British. Basically, not in the slightest. Russia was late to the industrialization game. We've talked about this before. But they're still trying to get that going, and they realize it. They realize that they're behind. But the one saving grace of the Russians is, holy cow, do they have a dang lot of people. Like it says here, they conscript up to 6 million men over the course of the war. Now, you get millions of men conscripted by the French, the British, and the Germans as well. But the Russians are conscripting men and then throwing them in on the largest battlefront of the entire war. They have some things that go well for them. Most of the time it doesn't go that well for them, but they hold the line, you could say. I'll show you a map in a little bit talking about that. But where the major breakdown comes with the Russians is, well, number one, it's the idea of the lack of industrialization. It's the lack of being able to have enough gear for those 6 million men. I'll give you some examples here in a second. But it also comes with leadership. Russia does have some excellent leaders. At the very top, the top of the spectrum, like with their lead generals, they do have some great generals. They know what they're doing. Known as, when I say great generals for the time period, people that can stand up to, say, the German generals, and definitely against the Austrian generals of the time period. I don't know how many Russian generals were, say, foresighted enough to see, oh wow, planes are going to impact us, oh wow, tanks are coming and things like that, or oh wow, this war was going to be won by the side of the last million men left standing. I haven't heard of anything like that with any Russian generals on that side of things, but they do have very experienced generals. It's when you get into the lower officers, like captains and things like that, where, well, how do you put this? The army was viewed as something prestigious. Something to be part of, but not necessarily to take part in. it's like the idea of like, well, you come from a wealthy family or a well-to-do family, and a mark of distinction is your service in the military. So what's the first thing you want to do for your son when he comes of age? Get him a post in the military. It's like, well, you're a captain now. All right, Dad, I'm a captain. What do I need to do? Just wear this suit and look pretty at balls. Now, I'm definitely exaggerating a bit there, but that's kind of the idea. Like, I hope you get what I'm talking about here. Like, it was a nice thing. It was kind of like being given that medal without earning it. And so you have a lot of guys that are put in the military that just don't have the training needed. This doesn't mean that they aren't willing to, say, lay down their lives for their country. A lot of them do. Heck, a ton of them do. They have this idea that, yes, we need to defend the honor of Russia and things like that. But when it comes to the battlefield, they're doing things where they're getting men killed because they just don't know what they're doing, and they get themselves killed because they don't know what they're doing. And then you lose that leadership, and just all chaos breaks out. And that was a major problem with the Russian army, especially in the very beginning of the war. That, in all wars, that starts panning out a bit, where you get the right people in place because they're still alive and they have the experience in order to keep alive and keep the men under them alive. But the Russian army goes in here woefully just unprepared. They're just unprepared for a war of this magnitude, and they don't think it's going to be that big. Just like everybody else, they think we're going to go in there, we're going to win a battle or two, and this thing will be done by Christmas. They have the same idea. They don't realize they need to have this massive infrastructure put in place, much bigger than they ever thought of before. To give you some idea, like, they had a massive stockpile of ammunition, thinking that, this will last us for years, and they end up using that in the first couple of weeks, and like, oh crap. Our industry can't keep up with how much we're using. So that's some of the major problems with the Russian army, and the idea of like the leadership woes and the industrialization woes going into this. Now, another thing I'd like to explain is how they deal with this. Now, this is probably one of the most talked about things that I've heard talked about when it comes to the Russian military, both in World War I and World War II. You see this in various movies done on this, and just, to explain it, just simply put, this is just a basic idea. It doesn't mean this was done every single time, but just a basic idea. The Russians are going to attack the enemy line. Say they're going to attack the Austrian-Hungarians or something like that. They give the first row rifles, but no bullets. They give the second row bullets. Maybe they give the third row bullets, depending on how many bullets they have. The idea here is that what's not expendable is the weapons and the ammunition. What is expendable are the lives of the men. Like, this is kind of mind-boggling and doesn't seem, definitely if you believe in any type of right to life or the idea that you want to keep your people alive, this is not a good strategy. But the idea is like, we know we're going to lose men, but we also don't have tons of ammunition and rifles, so we'll give the rifles to the front group. They got bayonets on them and things like that. And we're going to just rush at the enemy. The second group is going to be right behind them. Third line is going to be right behind them. Fourth line is going to be behind them. How many lines are going to have? Say they have 8 lines of men just going. We know that the enemy is going to open fire on them. But, right when we attack, that opening fire, if they attack us, it's hard to hit anybody at that point. Bullets lose velocity and things like that. We won't have much damage there. But once that first line starts getting close enough to the enemy line to where they're starting to drop like flies, especially those first line with the guys with the rifles, they start dropping like flies. Well, then the second line then can come up, pick up the rifle, then put the bullets into the rifle. Hopefully they don't get killed at that point, and then start firing back. Because the idea is if our guys are dropping like flies, then we can load our rifles with our very limited ammunition and start firing back at the enemy at that point, hopefully to get some success, all the while running forward. Now, if the second line dies, and most of them get killed, then the third line picks up their rifle, and puts in more bullets if they have it, and if they need to, keeps going, and if they die, then the fourth line picks up the fight and keeps going. And it's just kind of understood that, probably around like the second, not the second probably, but like around the third to fourth line of men charging, that you'll get into the enemy trenches. You have overwhelming masses of people in the hand-to-hand fighting, and you'll defeat the enemy that way. Now, if you've, this is kind of a generic example, but holy cow, kind of crazy. You see this in World War I when they have just this lack of equipment. Like, the guys in the back rows probably don't even have uniforms and things like that. They can't make enough stuff. This happens in World War II as well. a movie that shows this incredibly well, shockingly well, and, well, I guess grotesquely too, because they're trying to show what war's like, is a movie called Enemy at the Gates. I'm not suggesting watching this, but they do the thing where the first guy gets a rifle, the next guy doesn't, and the idea is, when he dies, pick up his rifle type thing. So, again, it was done both in World War I and World War II, where it just felt like life was cheap. And so I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, especially when we start talking about the Russian Revolution. When you're one of these soldiers and you realize that my life doesn't matter as much in the eyes of my commanders, you might be getting a bit pissed off. So that happens in all wars, but on the Russian side, it was much more poignant. So that being said, we're going to get into the beginning of World War I. Like, we're going backwards now in time. We talked a lot about what's happened on the Western Front. Now we're going back to the Eastern Front in the beginning. So all this, while like the Great Retreat and everything like that is happening on the Western Front, now we're going to the point where, stuff is happening on the Eastern Front between the Russians and the Germans and the Austrians. I'm mostly just going to focus on the Russians and Germans here. I'm not going to talk really much about the Austrians in this case. That they have a battle called the Battle of Lemberg. I'll mention it at the end most likely, but we're going to focus on the initial major battle between Russia and Germany called the Battle of Tannenburg that really sets the stage for the Eastern Front. So here's basically the notes to have for it. You can pause at this point, get this down as best as possible, but at this point I'm actually going to turn off the PowerPoint, and I'm going to go to an online whiteboard thing. I have something drawn up. It's rudimentary, but I hope it explains things well enough as we talk about how this battle goes. Okay. So, I'll come back to that in a second. So, well, actually, let's go back here. When we talk about the Battle of Tannenburg, the Battle of Tannenburg is taking place in this area right here. So my little drawing you're going to see is going to basically entail that area right there. And one of the things to know about that area right there, and I have this kind of in the middle, is I have this area called the Masurian Lakes. It's part of a larger marshland known as the Pripyat Marshes. One of the only major, you could say, natural obstacles in this area to hinder armies. And it does. It hinders the Russian army. They do not have good logistics. Talking about this before, I forgot to talk about this with industrialization, but they don't have good railway systems or roads either. Like, it's hard to get your guys anywhere. The Germans, amazing roads and railway systems. They can get their army where they need to as quick as possible. The Russians, they're hoofing it for a bit. They're walking. So the Russians have close to about 400,000 men. The Germans put about 150,000 men in to stop them. With those numbers in place, it seems like the Russians should just overwhelm the Germans and just walk over them. And the Russians totally expect to do this. But when they get to this area right here, and I probably should have labeled it, but this area right here is like marshland. It's just a straight up marshland. It's impassable. And the Russians also get some intel saying that the Germans have basically come up here and they're looking to stop the First Army first up towards a city called Tannenburg. Don't worry about that, but again, the Germans are worried. That's a major German city called Tannenburg. They need to defend it. So they think, we're going to do a pincer movement. We're going to separate our army into two different sections. We're going to have the Russian First Army with about 200,000 troops, the Russian Second Army with roughly 150 to 200,000 troops as well. And we're going to walk around the marshes, and when the Russian First Army engages with the German army, we're going to lock heads with them. Maybe we can beat them in a head-to-head fight. But just in case, the Second Army is going to come up and in a pincer movement hit the Germans in the flank or even from behind, and will destroy the Germans. Now, the problem for the Russians in this whole situation is, again, because they're a bit behind on everything, and the Germans and the French and the British are kind of the forefront of all this stuff, same thing goes for like espionage and spying and things like that. The Russians do not realize that as they set up their communications between these armies, they have, their communications are not radio. They actually have wires being dragged, like massive long wires for miles and miles and miles, and then different communication posts set up, relaying these messages, which is great for instant communication, but one of the main things you do to the enemy is you cut those wires, stop their communication. But the Germans realized, no, keep those wires in place because we're listening to them. The Russians had no clue about basically code, like at this point in the war, they don't think about code words or sending things in code, just in case someone else is listening. World War II, this is, I shouldn't say mastered, but much more advanced when you get to World War II on all sides. The British, the Germans, the Americans, we all do things in code. Like, have you heard of like the Navajo code talkers, like one of the great unbreakable codes of World War II? Anyways, sorry, going off a bit of a tangent there. The Russians don't get this. They're just like, yep, we're moving and we'll be here by sundown. The Germans hear that, it's like, oh, the Russians are moving and they're going to be there by sundown. So the Germans basically know the entire attack plan of the Russians. They know everything ahead of time, so therefore they can do all the necessary adaptations to meet the threat. And they think, all right, we are going to meet the First Army and then keep tabs on the Second Army and move against them when we need to. So basically, as the Russians, let's see if I can do this all right. As the Russians move forward, makes me feel like I'm in elementary school, but I hope this is working. The Germans move to meet them. Now, in the battle that ensues, I've heard a lot of different reports. It's basically said that the Russians win this one. They actually beat the Germans here. The Germans claim, like, well, no, this was part of the plan. We let them beat us because we're drawing them into a trap, and this does happen, but you get a major counterattack by the Germans that kind of forces the Russians off a bit. Where yes, the Russians win the initial part of the battle. I could say this is all part of the Battle of Tannenburg, and the Germans pull back. The Russians then get excited and start rushing forward. Pardon the pun. Not realizing that the Germans have defensive positions kind of like this set up. The Russians rush into that, realize that they're about to get outflanked, and then they essentially pull back. It's at this point, the Germans don't go after them at this point because this Russian army is coming up here. Now, they get word that things are not going well for the First Army at this point. And so they decide we need to get there as soon as possible, and we're going to come up and try to kind of skirt the marshes. This is not a good thing to do, because what happens here is when the Germans hear that, instead of following after the First Army, which is on the retreat at the moment, they got on a bunch of trains and very quickly get their whole army down to here and right here. Again, it looks different on a tactical map, but I'm giving you a basic idea. And the Russians, when they hit this, not realizing that they were not expecting the Germans to be in force at this point. They hit that, and the Germans just tighten the noose, coming in like that, where the Germans, basically that entire army of about 150 to 200,000 soldiers gets destroyed. And the survivors run into the marshes, kind of never to be heard of again. The First Army, when they then hear about this, they come back to try to set up a line right here. But the Germans do have some defenses still in place. And then they get word about the destruction of the Second Army, and they're just like, oh crap, and they just kind of stop, and you're at a halting point at this point. And this is definitely seen as a major victory for the Germans, where this, what seemed like a Russian juggernaut, was about to overwhelm them, but because they were listening in on the Russians, they knew what to do at the point they needed to do it. The Germans were able to win this one and hold the Russians at bay. Now, I'm going to go to this to explain what happens at this point. This shows the furthest advance of the Russians. Now, that's that city of Tannenburg that I was talking about, that the Battle of Tannenburg was really about. It was like, okay, you need to stop, we need to save Tannenburg, at least from the German perspective. And let's get a little bigger. But when they get stopped, the Russians are stopped pretty much at that point. But with something that actually goes very well for them, where this doesn't become a really bad thing, is against the Austrians with what's called the Battle of Lemberg. This is where the Austrians, oh God, I want to go into this more, but I'll just give you the basic idea. The Austrians don't do things the way that the Germans do it. Let's put it that way. The Germans are very good at listening, getting in the right spot, being on the defensive when they need to be on the defensive, going on the offensive when they need to go on the offensive. But down here in Austria, the Austrians just go straight on the offensive first. And they're going up, by the way, this is where the Russians put most of their troops. This is where they have their millions of troops down there. Austrians, probably about a third to half the size, they go on the attack against the Russians. And even when the Russians aren't as well equipped, again, we've already talked about the effect of machine guns and artillery and just how people didn't understand how effective they'd be. The Austrians get slaughtered. They get outflanked by the massive amounts of Russians that there are, and they're pushed past the city of Lemberg, and the only thing that really saves them is they run into the mountains, into the Carpathian Mountains. It doesn't say that in the map, but that's kind of what saves them. And then also what saves them is the Germans come down and try to outflank the Russians, which forces the Russians to kind of stop and redo a line, and that's kind of what you see with this red line here. But over time, the Germans, who then start kind of taking over the Austrian military, Austrians probably don't like hearing that, but they kind of start saying, you need to do this, and you better do this, and okay, we'll help you here, that type of thing, or here's some of our officers to help you out. Between that, they start systematically pushing the Russians back until you get a much even longer line, and then over time they get pushed back even further. But that yellow line you see right there is really the Eastern Front line of World War I. So at this point, though, I'm going to end this lesson. I hope I explained this well enough, and I will see you in the next one.